Okay, you're an economic historian. Let's talk some numbers here. How many natives were on the island he arrived at in the New World when Columbus arrived? Because judging by your book, this is something that has been thoroughly and vastly debated. There's all sorts of ranging numbers from millions to a couple thousand. So, what is sort of the true numbers we're looking at before and right when Columbus arrives?
Yeah. So, I mean, when he first arrives, there are people who are arguing that this island of Hispaniola has 7 million people on it. And that's taken from some estimate by a Marxist demographer in the 1970s, whose main goal was to make Europeans look bad because we have a census in 1530 that says there was only about 30 or 40,000 people left. So that looks like, holy cow, the Spaniards killed 6 or 7 million people. So then you get to the more realistic estimate by historical demographers of a couple 100,000 people when Columbus arrives. And that sounds much more reasonable. These people had very primitive technology with agriculture. They only grew tubers and roots and they only used hoes. They didn't have any animals, they didn't have any metal tools. So they could only grow so much food. They couldn't cut down the forest. So realistically, yeah, a couple 100,000 people on Hispaniola sounds about right. But they recently did a genetic study, which only modern technology enables us to do. And they found, and this is reported in the New York Times, that Hispaniola probably only had, quote, a couple tens of thousands of people in 1491. And then we have a census of 30,000 people in 1530. So, in other words, it looks like even with the disease and the wars between the Spanish and the natives, maybe 10 or 20,000 people were killed or just or left or died from disease. So these numbers of 7 million people on this tiny island, that was more than England had at the time, which was like 3 times the size and had the most advanced agriculture in the world and metal tools and lots of farm animals. That I mean, it's such a ridiculous number, and yet there's government-funded websites that say, "Oh, 7 million people were genocided on this island by Columbus." Complete fabrication. Even Howard Zinn thought there was only 200,000 there.
Yeah, that's preposterous. Because, you mentioned they have very primitive technology. It's their land and their way of life can't even support that many people. You have to look at sort of the geographical aspects of this. What can the land even support in terms of numbers? But let's talk causes of
Exactly.
death because, you know, maybe 10 to 20,000 people died, maybe 50,000 people died. A lot of people view this as, the wars and they were mass murdered, but in the reality, most of it was disease, but also um, something that I was very kind of blown away by is the aspect of intermarriage, and that also contributed to the decline in numbers. You say in the book that 61% of Puerto Ricans today have Tano, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, Tano blood in them. So they're descendants of that sort of intermarriage. So what are the true causes of death and depopulation?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, even the genocide scholars who are, crying genocide by the Spanish will admit that something like 90% of all people who did disappear died probably from disease. So, at least 90% of the casualties that you ever hear are disease only, and maybe 2 or 3% were massacred max. Then there's the other problem that a very unknown but large number of people just settled down and intermarried. Most of these Spanish guys were coming over, as single dudes, and they wanted to hook up as fast as they could. They'll marry a native woman, and at the time there was no idea they were part of a different race. And even more, there was an idea that if you marry the daughter of a chief, that she was actually noble. And Spaniards at the time had this honor culture where if you become a nobleman, this was the ultimate goal. So they actually thought by marrying a native chief's daughter, they were actually marrying up and making sure that their kids were nobility. So, I mean, that's the opposite of racism. So again, intermarriage is a huge number of disappeared people, and nobody has satisfactory ideas for that. What we do know is that the numbers of massacres are usually recorded, and we're talking like a couple hundred people at a time, max, or a couple dozen people. Nothing like the millions that are claimed.
Yeah, I think it's pretty hard to dispute and um, sort of disprove the idea that the disease was the main killer. But some people have argued that the spreading of disease was intentional and celebrated. What's the truth there? Was was the spread of disease a good thing in the eyes of the Europeans, an intentional thing, or was this something they wanted to prevent?
Okay, so we need to remember a couple of things. First of all, Europeans had traveled all around Africa and Asia by this time, and none of the native populations had succumbed to European diseases. Mostly it was Europeans dying of tropical diseases. So, if anything, Europeans were more worried about disease than the idea of spreading it. Secondly, we're talking it's the 16th, 17th century. They have no idea about technology, how disease works, biology, etc. So most of these disease deaths which happened hundreds of miles from the front where people were interacting with each other from the frontier. And so these people would die hundreds of miles away. No European had any idea this was happening. So we get these reports in early Virginia. Wow, there used to be lots of natives around Virginia, and now there's just not any. And the answer is they either fled west or they had died of disease. Before the Pilgrims arrived, something like 90% of the people in Massachusetts had succumbed to disease because they had been trading on previous English ships, and they had gone on the ships and just gotten disease. So then when we come to the idea of spreading disease, I was basically blown away to find out that there's one documented case in all of US history of people trying to spread disease to the natives via a smallpox blanket or anything like that. One documented case during the French and Indian War. The Spaniards are not known to have done this at all. And so it's literally a complete fabrication that every student thinks is true. A lot of professors just repeat this who don't know anything they're talking about, but there it is. That's what the historical record tells us.
That's interesting. So the data supports that. Now, I want to ask you about a specific book that you debunked in your new book, one that I have actually read. So I was delighted to hear you talk about it. Now, when I read this book, I was actually pretty compelled by what it had to say. This is before I ever really got deep into history and kind of devoted my life to it. But that is 1491 by Charles Mann here. Now, I read this book and I was pretty compelled by what it had to say. But you debunk it in the book. It basically says that there were vastly more people in the New World before the arrival of Columbus than previously thought. They were vastly more technologically advanced than we previously thought. But my question is, people read this book and then people read your book. How, as a common, casual reader, how are people going to be able to discern the truth versus these fabricated numbers?
Yeah, well, I mean, Mann is a science writer, he's a journalist, and he's really good at rhetoric, and he's really good at kind of sleight of hand. And so I mentioned that in my book. And when you read academic reviews of Mann, almost every professor who reads them says, well, some of the things that he says are true, and we have already known them for a long time, but he tends to cherry pick and then exaggerate some of the things while ignoring a lot of the others. So that's the general opinion in the academy. But for example, Mann says that the Aztecs were just as advanced as the Europeans because they had large cities with, a couple 100,000 people sometimes, and that there were a lot of them throughout the New World. But every academic who looks at Aztec society says, yeah, the tech level was impressive, but it was about the same as the Mesopotamian cities around 3000 BC. So they had proto writing, they were playing around with inventing the wheel, they could build large pyramids, they could build impressive stone structures, they had large armies. But The Aztecs were literally about, what is it, about 4,500 years behind the Spanish and the Chinese and the Arabs at the time. So man pretends that there were cities all over the New World, but they were in a tiny area around Mexico, and that little area around Mexico City had 50% of the whole population of the New World. Right there. And that's why Mexico today, almost everyone in Mexico is descended from those natives. They're part Spanish, part native because they all intermarried so much. And this was the population nucleus, but it was a small area, and man again exaggerates and pretends that that was the case everywhere. Yeah, so it's kind of sad because the Aztec and the Incan empires were these proto empires, just like very early Egypt, for example. And if they had been able to develop for another couple thousand years, they might have turned into Roman levels of civilization. But of course, they didn't get the chance because the rest of the world came knocking. And if it wasn't Europeans, it would have probably been Arab sailors or maybe Chinese eventually.
Yeah. I wonder, people like Charles Mann and these genocidal claims, these people who make these claims, do they really believe what they're saying, or are they trying to be sensationalists to get attention and money? Because, you know, even among academia, you say these claims have sort of been debunked. So it makes me wonder, do these people really believe what they're saying?
I think that they end up kind of drinking the liberal Kool Aid to such an extent that they just think they start being suspicious of everything that Europe and European society ever did. So it makes it way easier for them to believe that non European societies were kind of the good guys and that Europe was the bad guy. So they get this very simplistic idea and they just kind of run with it. I think they start to believe their own spin after a while.
Huh. Sort of what a lot of tyrants fall victim to. They begin to believe their own propaganda, and it eventually leads to their demise. Hopefully, it leads to the demise of this ridiculous ideology and these ridiculous historical claims. I'm quite hopeful of that, actually.